Hello, everyone. I'm having a chat with Ryan Dawson about the political situation in the Middle East. And I think we're going to start with the Syrian ceasefire, aren't we, Ryan?
Yes, that'd be a good place. It's a pretty confusing thing, and people are asking a lot of questions about it.
Yeah, okay. Well, I actually don't know all that much about it myself, as it's pretty recent news and I haven't looked into it yet. So, what can you explain to me about it?
There have been previous ceasefires in the past, and they didn't work out very well at all. But this one's been a two-parter. Parties met in Munich to hammer out a ceasefire, and it started on February 12th, and then they said they would continue on the 22nd to now, which is the second half of the ceasefire. And basically, some people are very excited about it, others are very pessimistic about it because it's a meeting between Russia and the United States, essentially, and they're saying, look, we need a truce, but ISIS is not on the table. Jabhat al-Nusra is not at the table. Al-Fatah al-Sham's not at the table. The three principal terrorist groups that are causing conflict in Syria aren't involved in this peace process. So exactly who is going to cease fire? You have these so-called moderate rebels who are supposed to pull back, and then they're going to ask the Russians to stop their air campaign. It's ironic because Vladimir Putin actually asked the United States to share intelligence with them to show where these moderate rebel groups were so that they wouldn't bomb them, and the US refused. Well,
Hmm.
now I assume they've changed their mind. But
Well,
if you really look at the moderate Syrian rebels, they're moderate only in title.
yeah, okay. Well, let's talk about the people who are going to be ceasing fire then, because this on the surface of it, it seems like a way for the Americans to try and restrain the Russians.
Pretty much that's what's happening is they're agreeing. See, there's a lot of chaotic groups, and there's three major terrorist groups and lots of little ones. And so some of these little ones, which of course they don't label as terrorists, they call them moderate rebels, but they're not.
Mhm.
They will be ceasing fire. And the goal is, the one good thing out of this is supposedly they're going to start airdropping humanitarian aid to certain sectors of Syria that really need it, food, basically.
Yeah.
And they want the Russians to not bomb those areas because the Russians have been bombing the terrorists. And the U.S. is saying, wait, you can bomb ISIS, but don't bomb these other people,
Yeah,
the
the
fragmented
rebels.
FSA, right? But the reason they're so desperate for this is because basically ISIS and al-Nusra have been pinned down. They've got Aleppo and Raqqa, which is like the capital of the terrorists, and they're being surrounded on all sides. And so now they're calling timeout. Wait, because they're losing. So every time this happens, they say, please stop the air campaign. Well, the Russians have said, well, we're going to continue to fight ISIS and al-Nusra. And if you have certain areas you don't want us to bomb, where you can clearly show us where there are whatever legitimate terrorists, then let us know. But they're gonna have to stop fighting the Syrian army as well, or we're gonna continue to bomb them.
Right. Okay. That's interesting because one of the major, and I don't know whether this is true or false. I'm just repeating the mainstream media line, is that Russia isn't actually fighting ISIS; it's fighting the moderate rebels. And I always feel inclined to explain to people, well, it should. Russia is the ally of Bashar al-Assad, and these people are Assad's enemies. Who did you think he was going to help? Um, this is completely expected and completely normal. And from what I've seen, they don't seem all that moderate. What's your
Right.
opinion on
Well, I agree with that. And Russia has its own interests. It's not some altruistic act on the behalf of Syria. The Chechen terrorists, which have been backed by the CIA by many years, have joined up with ISIS and these terrorist groups. And so they don't want this Sunni corridor extending all the way into Russia. And so out of their own national interest as well, they are taking out these terrorist groups. And almost half of these fighters are Chechens in many of these areas. And then you've got all these other groups in there, Turkmen and the Kurds, etc. And the Kurds are fighting for their own interests and temporarily are aligned with the Syrian government to fight the Turks and their proxy fighters. But yeah, what you said is absolutely right. These moderate rebels, I don't see how you can moderately behead somebody, or moderately eat someone's organs, or moderately kill children. And that's what they've been doing. I mean, the FSA was guilty of every single crime that we can point to that ISIS has done. The FSA had also done in the years prior. There's really nothing to separate the two.
Yeah, one of the things I found really interesting was when Assad was accused of using sarin gas, and the UN inspectors discovered that the sarin gas was probably used by the either the rebels or ISIS. I can't remember which one.
Well,
Um,
that's the thing there is that was the third time sarin gas had been used. And the previous two times it had come from the rebel groups. And on the third time, the entire reason the UN was in there was to inspect the second attack. And so while they're there, for their investigation of the second attack, suddenly there's a third one, and they only kill Alawites, which is Assad's own tribe. It
yeah,
didn't make any sense. And I had found videos from these rebel groups, these FSA, I'll just call them, bragging about it and showing how they're killing rabbits with this gas. And on all the labels in the background of where the gas came from, it's written in Turkish. I asked my old boss, who was a translator for the FBI, about it. What language is that? And she let me know. That was Sibel Edmonds. And so, yeah, obviously the Turks have a vested interest in causing conflict in Syria for its energy interests. I made a video about that, about 500,000 people watched, but it's a complicated game of pipelines. But they do not want a rival line. They don't want Iran and Hezbollah and Syria to gain power because it challenges their regional hegemony.
hmm absolutely. It's in the interest of Turkey to maintain. Well, is this why Turkey shot down a Russian plane?
That was stupid, but yeah. I mean,
Because
Turkey feels
I
golden
assume they're trying to
because they're
further.
part of NATO, and they feel like, oh, we're part of NATO. You can't hit us back. You can't do anything. That's what also has allowed them to continually feed ISIS with fighters, and they're getting a lot of this black market oil from ISIS. So Russia had been bombing these little caravans of trucks going back and forth, supplied by the U.S., by the way, that are bringing oil illegally from Syria into Turkey, and then it hits all the black markets, has been redistributed by the Turkish mafia and so on throughout the rest of the world. It's very needed oil and gas, considering that a lot of gas from Gazprom have been cut off because of the situation in Ukraine. So a lot of people sort of knew what was going on and looking the other way because they're like, well, we need the oil. And that is why Turkey bombed, or not bombed, but shot down a Russian plane.
Yeah.
It was kind of giving them the finger, saying, hey, why are you blowing up our oil supply? But they were thinking, look, it's illegal, and this takes out a huge method of finance for ISIS if we can stop their black market oil trade. And it's really something that this could be going on for so long. And as soon as the Russian air campaign starts, they'd immediately find these targets and take them out, whereas the U.S. had been there far longer and never stopped any of this oil trade. In
Well,
fact, they helped facilitate
the
it.
US is deliberately tarrying because I honestly have come to the. I honestly think that ISIS is not necessarily controlled by the United States, but they are I think, in the opinion of the United States sort of top brass, some sort of controlled opposition they can use against Assad. Because what was the general who said that they had the plan to take out 7 countries in 5 years?
Well, that was Wesley Clark, and he was
That's,
quoting a paper from Richard Pearl, who was the head of the Defense Policy Board at the time under the Bush administration.
yeah.
And Richard Pearl, of course, is the Captain Neocon archetype for the second Iraq War. He's the one that wrote or co-authored a paper called the Israeli Clean Break Strategy, which completely laid out what is happening in Syria right now and what happened in Iraq,
Yeah.
following off of Oned Yanan's plan. So
Because they've followed exactly that playbook, haven't they? I mean, they're still demanding that Assad go, despite the
yeah,
fact
pretty
that
much.
yeah,
They
yeah,
followed the playbook, except for the Hashemite kingdom in Jordan. They had to change a few things, but they are fostering sectarian violence. What they did in Iraq was verbatim what happened. It looks like the Israeli plan B is to balkanize the entire area because they're not going to get rid of Assad. That's pretty much off the table now.
yeah.
So they're going to try and balkanize the area and make little sectarian factions of, you name them. There's a lot of them, but Kurd, Shiite, Sunni, Alawite, and so on.
Yeah. I mean, what do you think? I mean, isn't that though the best probable outcome that we're going to get?
You mean realistic? I mean,
Yeah, yeah. I mean, realistically, I don't.
Yeah,
You
the
know,
best of the worst sort of situation.
yeah.
I don't know. I think possibly there could still be a better situation. ISIS, because of their antics, cutting the heads off of journalists and everything that they've been doing, have really alienated themselves. It's really hard for Turkey to openly be their ally. I mean, the U.S. is looking the other way, but the rest of the world is. And a lot of these neutral players like Japan, where I am, they are looking at it in disgust. Like, why are you helping the terrorists? It doesn't make any sense. With ISIS is controlled opposition in the sense like I call it Iran-Contra 2.0 for people familiar with that operation, where the U.S. publicly denounced it and privately financed them the whole time.
Yeah,
And it's not
and this
that
is nothing
they're
new in the United States, is it? I mean, this is pretty much that's part of the course, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, this is the U.S. plan. It's the U.S. who invaded Iraq. It might have been an Israeli plan, but it's the U.S. military and private militaries that went in there and destroyed the country.
Hmm.
And what they're facing is what George Bush Sr. called Vietnam syndrome. He used to say, we finally kicked the Vietnam syndrome after the first Gulf War,
Yeah.
because there was a real, bad taste in the mouth of a lot of Americans after the war of helicopters and heroin, also called the Vietnam War. And I think Bush's second Iraq war was like the Iraq syndrome. Like that war was so bad and sold to the public on bold-faced lies of weapons of mass destruction, which was a stupid form of propaganda, because what were they going to say after the fact when there weren't any there?
And not only that, I mean, we spent all the decades previously equipping Saddam. I mean, we knew what he had.
Well, yeah, I mean, the CIA put him in there as the Ba'athist, as a buffer to fight the communists. I mean,
we put him there.
We also backed Mujahideen too.
It's amazing that they could bear to speak the lie, let alone have so many people believe it. I'm constantly baffled. But anyway,
a lot of people didn't believe it. I mean, about 70% of people, even with a good year and a half of propaganda, still opposed the war in Iraq, and they just did it anyway. And then it became the propaganda that did work was this slogan, support the troops. Because it's like, well, we already started the war and you want to win, don't you? So you need to support the troops. They made it about the actual, like, our boys on the ground instead of, what our boys are doing.
Yeah.
And so that seemed to be effective. But it was, it was after 9/11. They just wanted to bomb somebody. I mean, you talked about low information voters. So
yeah, that's probably true. Okay, so let's talk about the moderate rebels then. These are the people that the US are openly funding with money and weapons, right?
Right. They gave them tow missiles. They said they were giving them non-lethal aid, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so the FSA was equipped with these Toyota Hilux, because that was very successful in all of our imperial escapades in northern Africa, like the war between Chad and Libya. It was called the Toyota Wars. It is a very durable truck, I'll give it that. But ISIS, if you've seen all these pictures of ISIS in their caravans with their black flags and machine guns and stuff, they're driving in what? Toyota Hilux by the hundreds that we supposedly gave to the FSA.
Right. I was going to say, I actually don't know anything about cars.
Oh, well, it's just a really cool pickup truck that it's easy to outfit. It's very durable and it's good for what they're doing. The new kind of fast modern warfare isn't using a lot of heavy armor. It's using trucks and motorcycles for urban fighting and such. And so it's dual purpose. So they can say, oh, we're just giving them trucks and we're just giving it to moderates. But it went to ISIS, and it's very easy to outfit these trucks with artillery pieces. And the U.S., through different mediums, through Saudi Arabia and the Turks especially, also Qatar. Qatar was very active in the beginning with the Muslim Brotherhood, which sort of morphed into the FSA, but giving them tow missiles. And one of these groups, Al-Fa al-Sham, which is Al-Qaeda, like Osama bin Laden, Al-Qaeda,
mm-hmm.
They were getting tow missiles to take out heavy machinery, heavy tanks, and so on from the Syrian army. And the U.S. is supporting this, and it blows my mind. And I point this out to people, and I pointed this out in a film I made. In 2013, this group negotiated a prisoner swap with the Syrians in order to get some of their lieutenants back for a man named Mohammed Zammar, who was the bagman money holder for Mohammed Atta, the ringleader of the 9/11 plot, according to the official story. Wow, not really? Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, but I mean of the hijackers. He was the ringleader. Wow. And they let his handler out of jail, and he's free right now. And this, I mean, that's an Al-Qaeda terrorist group, and we're still aiding these people until this year. And finally, they say, okay, maybe a lot of these people overlap with Al-Nusra Front, so we're not going to aid them anymore. But they are aiding them still. They're still aiding. They're still getting weapons and say, "Oh, it's accidental." Okay, plausible deniability, worthy of Oliver North.
Well, this is one of my concerns. I saw the footage of the Al-Nusra commander saying that they had very strong ties to ISIS, and I mean, I personally found that one of those to be one of those things that it's rather alarming that we would be giving money and weapons to people who are saying, "Well, yeah, we've got really strong ties to ISIS."
We
Um,
had a senator go and visit them. John McCain went and met with al-Nusra goobers and took photos ops with them, shaking their hands. And this is not out of incompetence.
no,
Not to say that John McCain isn't incompetent, but
no,
the
well,
people
that's what
they
I was
knew
going
what
to
was
go to
going
next, because I mean, I can't bring myself to believe that the U.S. government isn't aware that Al Nusra has really close ties with ISIS, and so continuing to give them resources seems to be an act of sort of willful sabotage of any attempt on the ground. And again, I think it comes from their desire to remove Assad.
on. Well, I think the desire to move Assad is a point that they sort of front. I think their main desire is just to break Syria and to
Yeah.
prolong conflict as long as possible. They don't
Mhm.
actually want to win.
No, I agree. I think that they probably want a sort of Libya situation, don't they? Where they just
Right.
want a bunch of failed states in the wake of what was, at least before, a cohesive nation, even if it wasn't like, a free secular one like we'd expect in the West. It's still,
It was pretty good by Middle Eastern standards, but
yeah,
those are pretty low standards. But it's sort of like Iraq. I mean, they had Shiites and Sunnis fighting each other for many years after the official war ended, hundreds dying every day. And you would see the US funding and helping both sides. The UK did the same thing, and they did the same thing during the war between Iran and Iraq. They financed and armed both sides.
right. So I mean, this looks like a deliberate campaign to balkanize it, like you were saying. Um,
I think that's the aim.
yeah, I'm really having trouble believing that it's not the aim. What bothers me the most is that the only person in the entire Syrian conflict I actually can even countenance to stand to listen to is actually Assad himself.
He's
When
the most
I
rational player.
Yeah, when I watch him in interviews, he seems quite intelligent, very well educated. He speaks good English, and he seems to not be crazy. He's not there screaming Allah Akbar, and he's not chopping up people's hearts or dropping
Right.
anyone off a roof or anything like that. I'm not saying that he's a
He is
good
very
guy. I'm sure he's a
educated.
terrible guy, but
I
it
mean,
just
he's
seems,
government, so he's not a great guy, but he's
yeah,
not the terrible monster that had. He's not like Saddam Hussein, like that level of screwed
yeah,
up. He ruled Syria for 10 years before this conflict started without any conflicts, and they weren't murdering people in the streets or taking people to the whipping chamber or anything like that. You could drink beer in Damascus. I mean, this is by Middle Eastern standards now. Far less corruption than because Assad is part of a minority party. There's a coalition of
yeah,
minorities against this
Alawites.
majority. Yeah. So it's the Alawites and Christians and all these other minority groups felt like, okay, we'll throw in with Assad because he protects us from this Sunni majority. And then within that Sunni group, you have the Wahhabis, and there's your Saudi Arabian crazies.
Yeah,
Like genital mutilation and all the rest of that fun.
yeah. The absolute like hardliners, aren't they? Um, okay, so what exactly is driving the rebels to rebel? I mean, ISIS. I can understand that it's like an ideological mission. I've read part of the management of savagery, and I mean, it's definitely a sort of distinct ideology all its own. But the other rebels, I assume, are just people who are discontented with the government, right?
There were very, very, very few of those, and it's really hard for any legitimate opposition group to ever take root in such an area because almost immediately from its inception, it's going to get hijacked by the United States and filled with crazies and used for their own agenda because they're looking for a pretext anyway. And a lot of people now in Syria just want the conflict to end because they're running out of food. It's that simple. I mean, you've got
Mm-hmm.
millions of refugees, huge problem. People want the conflict to end, but with ISIS, you've got hardline religious fanatics, and you also have a lot of just sort of disenfranchised youth from all over the world who are mercenaries. They're getting paid and they're raping people and shooting people, and they have an identity. We're ISIS. We're part of a strong, powerful group that is feared by the evil West and blah, blah, blah.
Well,
And they fall for
that's an
that.
interesting thing to go on to next, actually. I watched Vladimir Putin's speech where he was, the one where he basically just unloaded the truth as he understood it, that the Western powers are funding mercenaries in Iraq and Syria.
Oh, the one at the UN. Yeah.
Yeah,
He said, and a very vital line I got out of that speech, he goes, they're primitive, but they're not stupid. You think you're using them, they're using you. I said, bingo. He
Yeah.
nailed it.
Yeah,
It's
I
Putin
was
too. He's a
genuinely.
clever guy, not a nice guy, but he's a clever guy.
Yeah, it's the same with Assad, to be honest. I think that they're both rational actors, and I would rather deal with rational actors who understand the value of secularism over fundamentalist Islamists. I mean, it just
They're both nationalists too. Assad
yeah.
actually does care about Syria, and Putin really does care about Russia.
Oh, that you know what? That's one thing I have to try and explain to people about Putin. It's like they it's a lot like Donald Trump. They're sort of nationalists in the old mold, you know, and it's
He's
the
out
sort of
for
thing that
yeah.
we don't see much these days.
He has a long and strange history, but he played the Game of Thrones style almost, like
Hmm.
the way he needed to do to get in power. When Yeltsin was an absolute drunk, Yegor Gaidor was actually running the country, and he had a slew of oligarchs, principal among them Boris Berezovsky, Putin's total enemy, by the way, who passed away a couple years ago. And so you had, this fleecing of the Soviet Union when they were changing into what Russia is today. They didn't have venture capitalists come in and legally bid on the former state industries and divide up, metal and lumber and so on.
Yeah,
They had rigged auctions, rigged appraisals, and these oligarchs ran away with everything. And there was a large ruble overhang. And so what did Russia have? A lot of military. And then that's a lot of that obsolete Cold War era gear ended up going into these Eastern Bloc states. And so that's what ends up leading to Serbia and Kosovo and Chechnya and all the mess we've had since then. Where did they get those arms? They got them on the black market when the ruble literally was worth less than toilet paper. And you had about 1.7 million Russians starve to death in the 90s. I mean, it was really horrible transition. And people were celebrating, screw them, they're communists. And I thought, no, they're people. And this is horrible. I mean, it's good to end communism, but there were better ways to go about it than letting people starve to death and having oligarchs run the country. And Putin rose to power and kicked these guys out. He threw some of them in jail and he had the rest exiled. And they ran to countries where there's no extradition treaties like the UK and Israel, where some are still hiding. And so a lot of people love this guy. And so he's got a lot of clout in that country and he's a very clever man. And it's in his own interest to stop these Chechen terrorists and ally with Assad.
yeah.
And
That
they are.
the Chechens are something worth talking about. Now, as I understand it, the Chechens are a majority Muslim province of Russia.
They are Muslim, but not like normal Muslim.
Okay, what's the difference between them and normal Muslims?
Well, I mean, most Muslims don't act like Chechens. It's basically your craziest are the Chechens and the Saudis. That would be your most extreme,
Right.
right? And then you've got like regular Muslims, like citizens of Turkey, not their government or something, or just anywhere, wherever, Indonesia, whatever,
Yeah.
Iran. They're not absolutely mental, but these groups have been fostered. A lot of these madrasas and schools are fronts from the Safari Club, which is an outgrowth of the CIA. That basically they moved the CIA abroad when after Watergate and Carter was coming down really hard on them, and created this group where the Saudis took a lot of the old CIA cells and just moved them across the ocean, and made this clique between the Saudis, Israelis, the U.S., Morocco, and France. And uh, these groups have been fostering these madras schools. Saudi Arabia has a vested interest in religiosity because they are a monarchy that exists based on the belief that I'm your king and do what I say. It's really that 15th century.
Yeah. Um. Okay, so this is one of the fears that Russia has. Then is that the Chechens will find some sort of kinship and cooperation with ISIS, right?
Right. And
And
they
what are the
did.
odds of that actually happening?
Well, it was happening in Syria because some of the Chechen factions came. One of ISIS's first victories at an airfield, which is very important. They had to take out the Syrian air bases because they don't have a lot of anti-air. So if they can take over the airports, they have nowhere to land and they don't get bombed anymore. And their first victories came from these group. Omar al-Shashani, who's we call him Redbeard, was a Chechen who brought his forces, more experienced forces, in and said, watch. And they basically just kept going at the airfield, suicide running everything until they took it over.
Hmm.
And so But then at the same time, they had that victory, but then it also pulled Russia into the war to be the new Air Force.
Right. And how successful have the Russians been with the Syrians? As I understand it, they've absolutely obliterated any opposition they've come across, right?
They've pretty much, yeah. I mean, Russia is vastly more technologically advanced than any of the other players
Yeah,
besides the US. I mean, they're first in space and so on. Their weaponry is far more advanced, and there's really ISIS doesn't have an air force. I mean, they can't fight fighter jet versus fighter jet or anything. In a way, they have an offensive air force because the U.S. has bombed Syrian infrastructure, but the U.S. can't openly bomb the Syrian government the way the Israelis have on a few occasions, and they're definitely not going to attack the Russians. And when Turkey did shoot down a plane, the Russians put some severe economic and tourist restrictions on Turkey, which are hurting them.
Yeah, I was aware of that. Because a lot of Russians actually regularly holiday in Turkey, don't they?
I think the majority of their tourists were from Russia, not anymore.
Yeah, they
But
were.
yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's interesting. So so with the ceasefire itself, then, what exactly does Russia get out of this? I assume that Syria gets breathing space and probably time to sorts of what's the word?
Regroup. Right?
Regroup and just just become more
Well, I
secure.
think that the Syrian army, since they're on the verge of a major victory, is going to keep pressing on al-Nusra and ISIS. But what Russia gets out of the deal is in these certain areas of the map that they designate where there are not terrorists and that there will not be any fighting, then they will be able to deliver humanitarian aid. And that's something they really want to do because there are a lot of people on the brink of starvation. And so they all agreed that this would be the best course. You've seen scenes from Madaya and other certain towns in Syria. It's just terrible. And so they wanted to deliver this humanitarian aid. Now, in the past, the U.S. has used humanitarian aid as cover for aid for terrorist groups.
Mm-hmm.
But with Russia monitoring this, they'll be able to aid their side, and the U.S. is going to aid its side.
Right, okay. And do you think that the ceasefire itself will have any effect on the migrant crisis that's currently happening in Europe and in the local area, of course?
Not real. Well, it could in a way because it's leveraged to say it's something they can take away. Now they have something to negotiate with. But as far as the people on the ground, I mean, the migrant crisis has been going on for much longer than it's been getting attention. There have been migrants coming from northern Africa for a long time. A lot of these so-called refugees aren't from Syria. There are a portion of them that are, and of course you want to help people who are fleeing from a war, but there are a lot of economic refugees who are fleeing from predatory loans from the IMF and other things that European states have imposed, and now they're catching it. And it's not economically feasible to just absorb migrants forever. You don't bring the third world up, you bring the first world down. The best course of action would actually be, I mean, obviously stop fighting and stop predatory lending. But aside from that is you're going to have to help build infrastructure where these people live. That's the most cost efficient means, is to help them where they are rather than to absorb them in their states and burden your social welfare programs.
But okay, so do you think that maybe Russia has been capitalizing on the fact that millions of migrants have been heading west?
Yeah, they're not going to Russia, are they?
No,
they're not. They're going to where they can get the biggest handouts. I mean, why are people crossing all the way through all of Europe and getting all the way to Sweden for what?
It's amazing how they've become Merkel's problem, which I'm sure Putin is thrilled about.
Yeah.
This is what I was saying to a chap the other day. It's almost. I mean, I don't want to suggest that Putin is that good because I don't know that he is, but I mean, I can't imagine that he was attacking places in Syria and contributing presumably more to the refugee crisis, and not thinking, well, this doesn't help. It's a way of sort of destabilizing Europe and keeping a weak Western front, isn't it?
Well, the refugee crisis has been used to push European. You notice this comes about when they're all having elections and things. So it's been used to push Europeans further to the right and
Mm.
elect those who are going to support this war in Syria. So you have these flood of refugees and rape stories and stuff, and there are rapes there because that's what happens when you let
Yeah.
in the third world like that. But at the same time, that is galvanizing the public against that, which is actually leading their political spectrum further in that direction. But unfortunately, the new leaders want even more conflict, which is going to cause more refugees.
True, but I mean, it's massively politically weakened Merkel, who previously was in a really solid position before all this happened. I didn't, you never heard a negative opinion on Merkel. She was, some sort of golden child almost. And I mean, watching her
Yeah,
poll numbers drop, it's been if this is any kind of plan by Vladimir Putin to ruin Merkel's career, he's done a marvelous job.
well, he's the grand chess player. It's weird because Merkel was actually negotiating favorably with Russia with the South Stream line, but that's already done. So now they don't need her.
Yeah.
And once that's over, I wouldn't put it past Putin to plan all that out. But
Well, that's the,
it
I
really.
don't want to assume, but I don't think it's unrealistic. If we found like Putin's war diary or something with all these plans, I would be like, well, I knew it.
It's
But,
the great video of some comedy called The Slap, and they replace it's the guy going around slapping all these people, and
yeah,
they
yeah,
put Putin. Yeah, that's basically what he's done.
yeah.
I
He's
mean,
he's really done a magnificent job of controlling the chessboard, hasn't he?
he's definitely strutting right now,
Yeah, and
and
the thing is,
he's it's been good for people. I mean, if they get humanitarian aid into some parts of Syria, that's a great thing.
but not only that, like everything that he's done practically has been with a brilliant cover in much the same way Americans tend to have their operations, with as if they have a legitimate casus belli to do it. I
Right.
mean, Putin goes and says, "I'm going to fight terrorists in the Middle East." Everyone's crying out for that. Go on, then. Everyone's
It's like
suddenly
the
behind
U.S.
it.
in the 80s or something, because the U.S. used to be a lot more clever, and when during the
Mm,
Cold War when they had to hide it better, and
yeah,
now they've gotten sloppy. The
yeah, I
the
think so.
pretexts are so see-through. Part of that maybe because the internet lets people like you or me point it out right away, but I think they are really getting sloppy. I mean, they don't really hide things as well as they used to. The Iraq War was a complete disaster. The propaganda was horrible from a Machiavellian point of view. It was just not the way to go.
Oh, absolutely, and this is why I mean, I'm impressed with Putin. I'm impressed, but the thing is, he really puts the difference into real stark contrast. That we have, like, I mean, who was it that said with democracies you're going to end up with leaders who are just slightly more intelligent than the average voter?
Well,
Um,
it's the I don't know what the word is. It's like the result of the lowest common denominator.
yeah, yeah, but Putin really is showing that he's better than our politicians. He's much better than they are, and I think he's probably had a much more difficult political career than they have as well. So it's no wonder, he's obviously had to overcome much more impressive odds.
Well, there was a much stricter filtering process over there,
Hmm.
and whereas because they lost the Cold War.
Well, yeah, especially during the fall of the Soviet Union. Um, okay, so speaking of Cold War, then didn't Mendev declare that there was a new Cold War going on?
I mean, technically, the Cold War with China never really ended. So, I mean, you could argue that, but it seems like the military-industrial complex would love to have another Cold War.
Of course they would, yeah.
They'd love to start it up again.
Hmm.
And they called a lot of people after the coup in Kiev, they were making references to Vladimir Putin as Adolf Hitler. At the same time, they're supporting actual neo-Nazis. They're calling the other guy Hitler.
Yeah, what was the name of the neo-Nazi party in Ukraine?
So Stefan Bandera was the main leader of the Nazi party of Huckers in Ukraine. And this Bandera group, I mean, you have to understand, they had suffered under Holodomor on millions of people, 10 million people possibly starved to death
Yeah,
from the Russian communists. So a lot of them, it wasn't the entire Nazi philosophy that they bought into. It was just these guys are killing the Russians, so I'm on this team. Is that
Yeah,
basic?
because I mean, they actually didn't have like a Goebbels center or something, educational center.
No, it wasn't like that. It was just we want revenge on these people who killed our family members.
Yeah,
Plain and simple.
I'm sure I read somewhere that was the case, but fair enough. But yeah, but you know,
But
there's no getting
today,
around. They are like neo Nazis, right?
oh, they're neo-Nazis today, sure. I mean, but the U.S. doesn't mind supporting racists. I mean, whether they're Zionists or Wahhabis or neo-Nazis, if they're against U.S. enemies, they'll get support.
Hmm. Okay, so
I
let's
mean,
talk
we
about
finance
Turkey
religious
then.
fanatics all over the world.
Yeah, it's amazing the really nefarious people that the West will prop up when it's in our interests. I mean,
Mujahideen,
yeah,
Jandala,
well, any
MEK,
South American
ISIS,
dictator you care to name, you
pretty
know,
much. Yeah.
yeah, just you know,
Just had a coup in Paraguay in what 2014.
yeah,
You had the Contras, you had
yeah,
all the banana wars. I mean, yeah, lots of assassinations by the
Guatemala.
CIA. Yep.
Yeah, it's one of those things where the laundry list is just so long, and the people who we've supported in the West are so bad. And then I get pissed off when people start talking about Russia as if they're the bad guys. And it's like, look, I'm really sorry. I'd
Or
love to believe
Iran.
it was that simple, you know?
Who's Iran invaded in the last
Yeah, exactly. Iran
century?
haven't invaded anyone since the 18th century, so you know, when they're rattling the saber, I'm really not that worried about Iran. You know, I'm really not. Um,
Yeah, you're
okay,
more likely to get killed by a cop than you are a terrorist
yeah,
in the US.
by orders of magnitude, you know, terrorism, and you know, maybe they can make the argument that that's because we've got so many anti-terrorist measures and they're so good. And it's like, okay, well, you know, maybe.
Or you could argue that it is terrorism. It's just in a different uniform.
Yeah. Okay, so Turkey then. Turkey, as I understand it, has got about 2 million Syrian refugees. Is that correct?
hmm
And
Last I checked, I mean,
yeah, they've been threatening the EU with them, haven't they?
yeah, it's leverage to say, look, we're going to dump these. This is what North Korea just did to China, something very similar. It's like using refugees as a weapon.
Yeah, it's the sort of new humanitarian tactic, anti-humanitarian, I suppose, because they know that whoever's being threatened has to take them in.
Well, they also, Europe is very, very far on the left. Like
Yeah,
their whole paradigm of left and right is still left compared to the US.
of course.
And a lot of that's probably because of World War II. They're so like hesitant and scared of fascism or going that direction or nationalism at all. So the Swedes are the worst about this. They just yield to everything, and you can't even have a proper discussion about refugees because if you start explaining the very real economic infeasibility of it, when they say if you won't take in the refugees, you're just as xenophobic and a bigot and a racist, and these kind of labels. You're like, no. But people are so scared, especially on the left, of being labeled racist that they'll just bend over and grab their ankles for anything. Oh yeah, let's take them in, take everybody in, because I
Oh
don't
yeah.
want somebody to think I'm insensitive to this.
Honestly, it's quite terrifying the power of labels that has in Europe. It's terrible. I mean, we've had scandals like in Rotherham where
Oh
Muslim
yes.
gangs are grooming like 12, 13-year-old girls, and the police will like break into these houses where they're being held, and they'll like charge the girl as if she's some sort of prostitute, and these
And there were
guys have got to go
thousands
free.
of rapes,
Oh yeah, thousands,
right?
yeah,
4,000 or
thousands,
something.
1,400
Thousands.
in the Rotherham case. And it went on for over a decade, and it was literally down to people being afraid of being called racist, and it was just like that is insane. You've got the crime occurring in front of you. You've got the victim. You've got the perpetrator. You've caught them, and you don't arrest the perpetrator because you're afraid of being called a name. That's where
But
we're
it's
at in
it's a
Europe, isn't it?
very real political reality in that part of the world, and they know this, and they know they can use refugees as a weapon.
Yeah, and they absolutely will. I mean, notice how practically all the countries along the way to Germany, they closed the borders, didn't they?
Yeah.
Yeah, and the
I mean,
Schengen
because they
area.
can't handle it. It's not like a lack of empathy or something. It's just an economic reality. They don't have the money to take care of all these people.
Absolutely, and and that really is it as well, isn't it? Because I mean, recently we've had refugees flying back from Finland because they decided it was too cold, and I mean they sound like tourists. You know, they sound as if they've gone there for the money or something.
I didn't like this one. I want another refuge. I mean,
Yeah,
Japan only took in 29 refugees because they have a very serious filter, and all 29 were actual,
yeah.
Syrians from the war that they allowed to come to Japan. They said no to everyone else. Like 99% who applied got rejected, and people thought that was cold. I don't think so. Um,
But yeah,
Japan
I
has a
mean,
very strict immigration policy because if they didn't, they'd be Chinese overnight.
yeah, I think you made the point earlier that it would be better to fix the situation in their home country. That's the only real solution.
Well, that's what the Japanese did. I mean, they gave over 100 million to Gaza to rebuild and 100 million to Syria, and of course they, earmarked that in such a way that they hire Japanese companies, so it's a win-win. They get to profiteer, and but at the same time they are building quality houses, roads, and train lines, and so it was a
Yeah,
win-win situation. And more countries should be acting that way. You can
yeah.
profiteer off of
You can't
reconstruction
expect
and
them not to operate within their own interest. Um,
well, it's identity politics. I mean, the U.S. constantly does things that are not in its interest, but it is in the interest of very select few
well, yeah,
corporations.
that's the thing, isn't it? It's always in the interests of the Rumsfelds and Cheneys, um,
Yeah.
rarely in the interest of the privates, is it?
Well, the Syrian conflict has given a theater of war for the F-35 and F-22, which those planes don't really work, but they're fighting people who don't have an air force and no AA, so it doesn't really matter if the planes work or not. As long as they can, get off the ground and get back, there's zero chance of them get shot down or anything. But the F-35, they spent $1.5 trillion making this hybrid piece of junk. It's basically a Bradley fighting vehicle with wings. It can't do anything right. There's a laundry list, a really long list of all the problems with it. But 1.5 trillion, that's 8.3% of the entire debt of the United States was on one airplane.
Right. Okay. But obviously, there are going to be a select group of people who are very much
Yeah.
profiting from these bad decisions.
Yeah, Lockheed Martin loved it. They got all the money.
Yeah. Yeah.
Lockheed
Um,
Martin was the seed money for PNAC and Weekly Standard, and the people that gave us the propaganda for the war in Iraq. You can see this circle where people have overlapping interests, whether it's ideological or purely monetary, but they gang up to create conflicts so that they can all profit.
okay. Right. Let's talk about Saudi Arabia's involvement in the Syrian civil war. Then, what has it been, as far as you're aware?
So Saudi Arabia is involved in basically every conflict where you have Wahhabi fanatics. Saudi Arabia does whatever the U.S. asks it to. But Saudi Arabia and Qatar were both sharing territory where Iran was drilling for gas in the Pars gas fields, there was a pipeline deal to go from Iran through to the Mediterranean through Syria, and it has to go to water because you have to have a port to be able to export it everywhere. That was signed up right after the Iraqis kicked the U.S. out. And so they're going to build a line through there, and it was worth $10 billion. You had all these investors. And so suddenly conflict in Syria, which completely nobody's going to invest in a pipeline that can be blown up in a day.
Yeah.
And so Saudi Arabia does not want their Shiite power rivals like Iran to prosper. They want to maintain the way it is, the status quo. And so if Iran gets bigger, and the Shiites already took over territory in Iraq as a result of the Iraq War, Chalabi double-crossed people, and Iran and Shiites end up running Baghdad. And so they're not going to allow Syria to have the same fate. They want their own Sunni, especially Wahhabi Salafist factions, to make a Saudi Arabia 2.0 with ISIS in Syria. That keeps
Right.
them in
So
power.
yeah. So it's in Saudi's interest to keep everything divided and in flux.
Keep it divided, and also to keep Iran down, to make sure that
Yeah.
they don't expand in their power. Because
Right.
Saudi
Okay.
Arabia is really on the ropes. I mean, they're completely dependent on foreigners to build everything for them.
Yeah. And I mean, financially, the kingdom's entirely dependent on its oil wealth, isn't it?
Pretty much. And
Um,
the U.S. has asked them to keep oil prices low production wise because
yeah.
that hurts the Russians because the Russians are a major oil exporter also.
Hmm.
And so the Saudis have agreed to buy numbers of F-35, for example, and they're bombing Yemen, but they can't even defeat the Houthis in Yemen. The poorest country in the Middle East is militarily defeating the Saudis. So they're really a huge paper tiger
Yeah.
with lots of oil that everybody uses.
Well, yeah, I really would not be surprised, to be honest. And so, okay, so Iran then. The primary, it seems that they're the primary rivals of the Saudis in anything. Um,
Yeah.
Obviously, this is down to sort of the schism between them in religious terms. But what's Iran doing with all of this going on? Because I assume that they're allies with Syria, right?
They are. They're energy rivals with Saudi Arabia too, because
Yeah. They've
Saudi
got the
Arabia has
huge
the
oil
largest
wells.
oil reserves, Iraq number two, Iran number three.
Yeah, yeah.
But Iran is geographically positioned with the Caspian Sea and everything to where they can go both directions. They could go towards China through Pakistan, and they can go to Europe.
Yeah,
And
and they've got the Persian Gulf as well.
right, so
Um,
the
yeah,
writing's on the wall.
yeah.
And
So
especially if they get their nuclear program going for nuclear for electricity, they'll be able to free all of the current oil that they consume making electricity. They'll be able to throw onto the open market, and that's very important because if you cross the line to where you're profiting enough to where you're not taking out large loans from banks and paying off interest, then you become economically independent and free of the central banking cartels. And they really do not want Iran to have nuclear energy. And they say it's for the nuclear bomb, but they don't want them to have nuclear energy because it gives them more oil independence. But it's best for the rest of the world. I mean, you get cheaper petroleum. That's good. Iran prospers more. That would be the good thing. But they don't want that to happen. They're power rivals for the Saudis.
yeah, because
And also,
isn't really the key to bringing down like a heavily intolerant religious theocratic regime increase the standard of living of the people living under it?
pretty much. I mean, you increase the standard of living and education, and the religiosity goes away on its own.
Yeah. So that would literally be the key to defeating the theocratic regime there. It's interesting how this conflict has put Israel and the Saudis in their interests have become aligned, haven't they? Practically.
They have. I did a podcast with Dan Sanchez from antiwar.com that went over that in a lot of detail, but they've had this strange alliance for one reason or another since World War II. Well, obviously Israel didn't exist
Yeah.
before World War II, but
Yeah, yeah,
since its inception, they've been together.
yeah. It's interesting how they've got the same goals, or at least similar goals. Okay, so why isn't Iran providing any real support to like Syria or Russia, or are they? I'm just not aware of it. Of it.
Iran's been giving support mostly to Hezbollah, and Hezbollah has been giving boots on the ground support to the Syrians.
Yeah, right. Okay. Um, that's interesting. I so really, it looks like Russia has completely outmaneuvered the US in this situation. The US and its allies in the Middle East.
You could see an increase from Iran too, but Iran wants these sanctions lifted, and supposedly, I mean, some of them have some of their assets were unfrozen, for example, $100 billion, but they can't really openly support the Syrians as much as they want because the U.S. can hold that carrot and say, look, we'll just take that away and put the sanctions back on. So that's kind of what's been keeping them down. But they've never withdrawn support from Hezbollah because that's just not going to happen.
Yeah. But okay, so I mean, what room does the US have to maneuver other than the ceasefire? I mean, that seems to be all they can achieve, really, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, they can stall for time, and I think what the U.S. they're going to aim towards balkanization, and they're going to push the Turks to step it up a notch, and the Turks because they've been ethnically cleansing Kurds for decades,
Yeah.
uh, they're going to they're not going to let that go because the Kurds are going to be an ally, whatever new government arises in Syria, because the Kurds have been fighting alongside them the whole time. They're going to come out very favorably. It's probably still going to be Assad, but they don't want that to happen. And so I think they're going to push the Turks to get more involved in supplying and supporting ISIS and continuing the fight around the major cities. But it looks to me like they're going to lose.
Why do you think that? What the Turks are going to lose against the Kurds?
They're going to lose because if that continues to happen, Russia is just going to start up its air campaign again, and it'll be back to the way it is. But the way it is now, they're losing, and Russia and Syria are winning.
Hmm.
I can't really see anything. I don't want to say anything of how what the U.S. could do. I can think of some options, but I'm not giving them any help.
To be fair, they've probably got it covered. I mean, they've
Maybe
probably got some of the most Machiavellian minds in the various think tanks that advise, haven't they? So,
they probably have figured it out, but why make it for certain, right?
I suppose. Okay, then. Well, that's been a really interesting rundown. Actually, I'm glad that I was fairly on point with most of what I was saying, because I tried to follow this quite closely because I think a lot of a lot of Europe's problems are stemming directly from these conflicts. So I think it's important to understand them.
It's from their own political culture too. I mean, you gotta be able to have thicker skin than someone calling you a name.
Yeah,
And if you really want to help refugees, then where was this fire and passion? Like, why aren't you talking about what causes economic refugees? Not just the wars, but predatory loans from the IMF and others, and all neocolonialism in Africa. I have a video on that too. I mean, you have to see that, and it is wrong what they're doing. And if they weren't doing that, you wouldn't have all these uh, refugees trying to seek status. And also, you have to really examine your social welfare programs because you're incentivizing failure.
yeah. I mean, I'm quite a socialist in some ways. I like the idea of socialized healthcare and welfare, but I mean, the very nature of these things prohibits mass immigration. If you want these things, you cannot have mass immigration. And so, this is generally why I'm against mass immigration. Um,
Sure, and you could have healthcare that was functional, that wasn't socialized. The problem with the U.S. is they use bad government regulations that prevent market competition and prevent negotiating down the price of procedures and drugs. It really doesn't matter what all ratio comes from you or from your boss or from the government when the total cost is extremely high. And if you don't allow free market competition to bring down drugs, if you don't stop patent abuse, like in the US, you can't even cross state lines to buy insurance, so they're not competing with each other to bring the price down. It's a complex issue, but there are ways where it could be cost efficient, where it wouldn't be necessary to have the government pay for everything.
yeah, okay, and I think the you touched on the IMF, which is definitely something a lot of people, and including myself, don't fully understand or even really
Yeah,
slightly.
the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank, there's all these, it's just like a really large bank. Think of it like this, not for
Yeah,
you, but for whoever. Um, they issue out predatory loans on purpose. So, in a lot of African nations, for example, Africa is the most resource-rich continent on Earth, and yet it's home to many of the poorest places in the world too. And
yeah,
he's like, why? If they have all these resources, it's not like all the people there are just lazy or stupid. I mean, they work. It's just they don't really own their own products. They're selling a lot of raw resources and then buying back finished goods. And of course, finished goods cost more than raw resources. It's better to sell a tire than it is just rubber. It's better to sell a candy bar than just chocolate or just cocoa.
yeah,
And but the way these European commodity companies have gobbled up Africa from since way back when, and have bribed. Well, there's different systems for different countries, but there's several methods of colonialism, and one of them from the IMF is by issuing predatory loans, like in the housing bubble in the United States, where they purposely give more than what can be paid back. And the only way to pay off these loans and interest is to sell off their raw resources and commodities, which they're doing. But then they're going to have to borrow money again because they don't have profits which can be thrown into infrastructure for highways and roads and all the things that governments can do, schools and things. If they were getting loans for manufacturing and making finished products and they're using that tax revenue to build their infrastructure, it would be debt free. But instead of they won't allow them to have loans for manufacturing. They only give them loans directly to build the road or the school, whatever. But roads and schools don't make profits.
yeah.
And well, I mean, the profits
Not in
from
the short term.
school are way, way down the road, right?
Yeah,
So you need businesses. This is how this works. And so they won't give them loans for that. And so the typical like non-political person will look at it and go, well, yeah, I want to help them. I want to build a hospital in Zambia or whatever. But it doesn't help them down the road because it drives people into debt. But of course they can't say, well, I don't want a road or I don't want a school. They do. But their whole economic model is just upside down. It's liberal hell. Extremely high tax rates, extremely high restrictions, and they're not manufacturing. They're not making finished products. They're getting way over their heads in debt. If a business borrows too much from the bank and can't pay it back, they simply go out of business. But when
Yeah.
a government does it, the entire country suffers.
Yeah, and the taxpayers are the ones who end up shouldering the bill, aren't they?
The taxpayers, and they get these bad deals where it's like, oh, for the next 99 years, you're going to sell
Yeah.
resource X to us at a really, really low rate. And
Okay. Let's it might be worth explaining to people what the BRICS Bank is then.
yeah, the BRICS, so that's sort of like a rival competition arising to the World Bank and IMF, and it's just the first letter of several nations. You've got Brazil and Russia and India and China and now South Africa as well, who are making a counterbalance to this very US-centric IMF and
Yeah, and
World
they
Bank.
tried to get Greece in, didn't they, during Greece's governmental crisis?
Yeah, but then you wouldn't have a cool sounding name where you can say Brickage.
That's true. But the thing is, it was obviously a power play. It was obviously being offered to fuck with Merkel. Um, I don't think anyone really expected it to happen or anything like that. But it was obviously something to give the Greeks some leverage.
Yeah, and again, going back to Putin's playbook, it would be really fun in the future to see him be like, "Yeah, I planned that all out."
Yeah. Well, that was the thing, because I mean, one of the major objections to it, everyone was like, "This is ridiculous. The charges to join BRICS are higher than it is to join to get a loan from the IMF, and so how
Yeah,
could Greece possibly afford it?" And I mean, obviously, Putin would have known this. He's doing it as a power play,
yeah,
very obviously as a power play. It's not, it's
yeah. Often too, people are so hyperly against Western imperialism, which I totally understand. But then the wrong thing to do is to say, well, like China is against America, so they're the good guys. Not
yeah,
at all. They're both imperialists. Actually, the Americans are better than the Chinese if you want to pick the lesser of two evils. Um, it's wrong kind of thinking to go, well, these people stand up to the U.S., so that's the good team. There's no good team. They're all government.
yeah. They're all amoral entities. That's what I think people have got to remember.
Yeah,
Um,
they're just competing for their own slice of the pie. They would
yeah,
love, China's been pushing in to exploit Africa for many years too. And
yeah,
Africa is mostly China and the Europeans. For once, it's not the Americans, but uh, the Middle East is the US's playground, and Latin America is their other original playground.
yeah. This is what a lot of people, and especially people coming from these nations, seem to forget. It's countries are not moral actors. They don't have a morality. They don't think anything of murdering individuals. Collateral damage is something that's inevitable in every war.
That's something to talk about too, is the language that is used, like collateral damage
Yeah,
or enhanced interrogation and
yeah,
things. It's, come on, call it what it is. It's torture and murder.
yeah. I mean, this is the lesson that the US learned in Vietnam, though, isn't it? If people get to see what happens and refer to it as it is, then they're very much against the idea, because they think
Right.
of it on a personal level, don't they? And they think, well, that's
Yeah, and
awful.
Vietnam also had the draft, so
True.
it could threaten anybody's kid. So that got people who normally, with the voluntary military, the U.S. is like, nah, I ain't for that war, but they're not actually going to go out in the street and do anything because it's not their kid, it's not their skin. But when there's a risk of someone they know having to risk their life, then suddenly the war is immoral and bad.
Yeah. Um, so yeah, I always get annoyed when people try and hold states to the same standard they would hold individuals to, and when these states don't fulfill these standards, they declare them to be the bad guys or the good guys and whatever. And it's not a useful way of modeling the world when you're talking about great powers and the great game. It really annoys me. Um, Okay, so is
Yeah,
there
it's
anything that
also
we
this
haven't?
first versus third world thing isn't really a good dichotomy too, because most of these despots in the third world are just as terrible as the imperialists. I mean, they're
Oh, God.
partners in crime. It doesn't work without one of them. They have to work together.
Yeah, I mean, like the perfect example of that is just the dictators the US and the West have been willing to not only work with but completely finance
Yeah,
in
Paul
order to.
Kagame or Good Luck Jonathan or any of these Charles Taylor for a while.
Just literally, there is such a long list of them. It's not even. It doesn't even bear thinking about. So yeah, I do get annoyed when people try to reduce it to good and bad. It's not.
Well,
Um,
it's the old GI Joe Star Wars model of the world.
yeah, yeah. It is a childlike model of the world, isn't it? Um, okay, so is there anything that
Wait,
we
did you
didn't
just
cover?
call Star Wars fans childlike?
No,
I'm just trying
I'm
to get you
just
some
saying that
haters. I'm
viewing the
kidding. I'm
world in
kidding.
good or evil, it's for Hollywood movies, and myths and
Yeah,
legends.
it's
And
a
don't
Vince
wrong,
McMahon.
that's fine. They've got their place. Um, so yeah, was there anything that we haven't covered that you think we should cover in regards to this conflict?
I don't know. We covered a lot of ground. I think that's enough for people to digest for a while.
Right. Okay. Cool. Okay. Well, that's good. Right. Okay. So I imagine there'll probably be plenty of comments and questions, and I suspect that in like a month or so, the situation will have changed dramatically again.
Hmm.
So would you like to do another one of these another time?
Oh, absolutely. I'll come on whenever. Thanks for having me, by the way.
Oh, that's all
I
right.
didn't.
Thanks for coming on. I always enjoy talking power politics, but few people seem to enjoy it. So.
Oh, I'm a total nerd for that kind of stuff. I didn't even know you followed my channel till that
Oh,
we were
I've been following
introduced.
the channel since you had about 5,000 subscribers, I think,
Oh, wow.
because I'm into this sort of thing. I absolutely love this the great game. Um,
Nice.
so
Yeah, I've
yeah,
been deleted twice, so you must have found me in the third ring or whatever.
yeah. I didn't even realize you've been deleted actually. But yeah, I've been
Yeah, I had
following you for a
all
while
my
now.
videos erased. Do you imagine how devastating that is? It's gone.
Yeah, man, that must have been terrible. Um,
Terrible.
but yeah, okay, man. So yeah, thanks for coming on, and I'll definitely do another one of these again in like a month or so.
I have to have you on my channel to talk about feminists and such too. I think that
I
would be a
would
fun.
love to actually, because you did say you wanted to talk about identity politics and all sort of regressive left, and
I have avoided it, and I feel that I should tackle that too. I mean,
honestly, it's a quagmire, but it does need to be tackled. I think
I
it's
feel like it's a foot. It's like Gamergate and stuff. Some of it's kind of silly, but it's sort of a foot in the door that leads people into other more important issues. It kind of red pills a lot of people on subjects that they wouldn't have cared about, and then now they do.
yeah, and I think one of the things to remember with the sort of regressive left is that they're weaponizing social pressure, and it's unusual. Normally this is normally only done by like religious entities. Like weaponizing shame. Um,
Hmm.
and so most people, if it's not coming from a priest, they're not ready for it. Um,
Yeah, well, I mean, that was the progressive left that led to prohibition. It seemed like it was the evangelicals that wanted to outlaw alcohol and all, but it's the horseshoe theory or whatever, where the progressive left was every bit as evangelical, albeit for different reasons. But they're the ones that want to control everybody's life, for the sake of someone else, of course.
yeah, absolutely. For some unknown group, unnamed group, or even a named group, it's just people they don't know. They don't haven't been asked to represent them. They
There's a really
they
good
go wherever
breakdown
they
of
go.
that in this book called The Moon is a Harsh Mistress, where they go over that type of thinking. Really great breakdown. But anyway, I'll
Yeah,
let you go.
yeah.
Taking up a
Thanks.
lot of your
Yeah,
time,
I've
but
got to crack on. But yeah, we'll definitely do this again. Thanks for coming on,
yes, appreciate it.
and thanks to everyone for listening. Take care, everyone.